Welcome to talkSPORT USA with myself, Will Varney. Great to have your company as ever. The season's not done just yet. We've got Championship Weekend, Super Bowl 60 live from Levi Stadium on talkSPORT to come as well. But the NFL head coaching cycle, it is in full swing. We're already seeing jobs being snapped up. And really one of the most fascinating still on the market has to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. Right now, after 19 seasons, Mike Tomlin deciding to step down. So much talk about what's going to happen in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania this offseason, looking at candidates, who is going to be the right fit. Pleasure to say, to give me a bit more insight and to get stuck into this topic, it's as ever a great friend of ours, Mike DeFabo, Athletics Steelers reporter. Mike, how are you, my man?
I'm doing great. Before we started recording here, you talked to me about how you're a bit jet lagged from being overseas and being in Seattle. I completely feel you. I think covering back-to-back primetime football games and then Mike Tomlin's resignation, now the coaching search, I feel like I've been in about 5 or 6 different time zones over the last couple of weeks. So I'm right there with you, but very exciting time here for the Pittsburgh Steelers. They've had just 3 head coaches since 1969. This does not happen often, so it's very big news and a lot of intrigue around this team.
And as ever, we really appreciate your time because I can imagine it's a very busy period with a lot of coaching interviews happening not only today, but also this week, which we'll get stuck into. But firstly, last week I found myself in Santa Clara in California, and I found myself reading and I have to admit, it was a phenomenal article. Really, really enjoyed reading it, the article about the locker room emotion and that feeling amongst the players and the coaching staff when they found out through Mike Tomlin that he was going to step down after 19 seasons. I wanted to just get your perspective first on whether you were surprised when you found out that Mike Tomlin was going to step down. It feels like the players were really taken aback, but from your own personal opinion, did you see this coming?
You know, there's been a lot of speculation about what was going to happen with Mike Tomlin. And as we talked about in Dublin, there's such a big difference between maybe the national or international perspective of Mike Tomlin and the local perspective. Nationally, people look at him and they say, he went 19 years and he never had a losing season. That's remarkable. And then you look on the flip side, locally, people say, well, he hasn't won a playoff game in 9 years. And this is a franchise that has won 6 Super Bowls. They're used to competing in the playoffs. At one point, week 13, they started chanting "Fire Tomlin" at games. And so I just think that maybe, at least to some degree, I think there were a number of different factors that weighed into his decision. At least to some degree, I think that he felt, hey, look, this is a city that doesn't appreciate me like they once did. Maybe it's my time to step away. But, you know, to answer your question more specifically about was I surprised, we have a lot of reporters at The Athletic, and Diana Rossini is our national insider. And she kind of tipped me off on the Thursday ahead of the final game and said, hey, look, you better have a story ready. I'm hearing this could be a real thing. And I asked a couple of people that I'm close with inside the building, and the response I got from them was, you're crazy. You're wasting your time. There's no way he's going to step down. This guy is a competitor. They're going to have to drag him out by his feet before he walks out on his own. And sure enough, they walked into that meeting, and a lot of people were surprised by Mike Tomlin deciding that he was going to step away.
I think so many people were. Like you mentioned, he's known for being such a competitor, that storied history that he has, and the history really around the organization, like you mentioned, just 3 head coaches since 1969. So for him to make this decision, I think it's left many people questioning what's next, and that's something we'll definitely get into in a moment. But I wanted to sort of get your perspective on here in the UK with our football. We see a lot of times legendary coaches who choose to step down are then almost used in the consultation process for the next head coach who's to fill their shoes. I just wondered, I'm not sure how it works with Pittsburgh. Are you aware of anything where Mike Tomlin may be consulted on who is to be his successor, or is that not a thing?
For this specific instance, I don't think that he's going to be involved. What I'll tell you, though, is the last time the Steelers were in this situation, Chuck Noll had resigned. I think it was 1992. He was really the coach that built the Steelers. They won 4 Super Bowls and created a dynasty in the 70s. And when he stepped down, I think it was more he was involved. Well, actually, let me fast forward. When Bill Cowher resigned before Mike Tomlin got the job, a lot of people thought that, you know, he had a lot of really good coaches still on his staff. And specifically, he had Russ Grimm, who was the offensive line coach. And everyone kind of thought that it would just be like a succession plan where they would just pass the torch from one Steelers coach to the next. And so they kind of surprised people when they went out and they hired Mike Tomlin. And even Art Rooney, the team president and owner, said that until they interviewed Mike Tomlin in person, he didn't think that they were going to hire him. So that's a long way of saying that essentially in the past there have been like succession plans or, kind of passing of the torch. But in this case, it's basically totally cleaning house. All of the assistants are going to be gone. All of the coordinators are going to be gone. It's going to be up to this next head coach to build out his new staff. And that's going to be part of the intrigue of this job is they're going to have the autonomy to build their own staff from the ground up.
So let's mention some of those candidates then. Right now, at the moment, we've seen Brian Flores has had an interview today. Mike McCarthy having an interview. There could be potential he doesn't even leave the building if they really fall in love with his vision for the team. And before we touch on Mike, I wanted to speak about Brian and him coming and having that interview. What have you been hearing around the building? Because look, Brian Flores is out of contract this year with the Minnesota Vikings. He's built one of the best defenses in the league. What are some of the noise that you're hearing about how that interview went and how he's seen within this organization?
Yeah, I mean, the Steelers do keep things pretty tight-lipped, so they're not tipping their hand, but I have heard that he's going to be in the mix until the very end. And if they come up with a list of finalists, he's going to very likely be on that list. And so to give you a bit more background, I mean, at one point he was a head coach for the Miami Dolphins, did not go very well. He ended up getting fired. Then he ended up suing the league and alleging racial discrimination and discriminatory practices in hiring, and that this team wanted him to tank so that they could get a top pick, only to then get rid of him. So he was a bit of a pariah at that point. And the Steelers brought him in, and when no one really wanted to touch him as a defensive analyst in 2022. So they have great familiarity with him to the point that they've conducted virtual interviews with a lot of candidates. They didn't even need to have a formal virtual interview with him. And so they know him well. And you mentioned his aggressive style. The Steelers, they talk about Blitzburg, the Blitzburg Steelers. He very much would fit that in terms of a blitzing, aggressive kind of personality. And the other interesting thing about him is he started his career as a scout, which is a unique background. So on the player evaluation side of things. And coaches in Pittsburgh have a really big say in personnel decisions. And so if you're going to have that type of an organization, it's kind of a head coach organization where they're the one making a lot of the calls. Having a background within player development and player evaluation, I think, could have a lot of value.
So then on to Mike McCarthy, which I think is fascinating right now. When I look at the social media forums, I feel like the overwhelming reaction that I'm seeing from supporters is one of really frustration and maybe underwhelming, maybe to put it lightly. But right now it feels like that is the reaction. He's taken a year out after being the head coach in Dallas. He's been part of the Pittsburgh Steelers before as a previous wide receivers coach and an offensive assistant, so he knows the organization as well. What is the feeling over in Pittsburgh right now surrounding the potential for Mike McCarthy to take over this organization?
Well, I think a lot of people look at it, and the main thing is he's 62 years old. And historically, what the Steelers have gone with has been a guy who's very young. Mike Tomlin was the youngest head coach in the league and was, at the time that he won the Super Bowl 2 years later, the youngest coach ever to win the Super Bowl. And their formula previously has always been bring in a young guy, and he provides stability and continuity for decades, like decades plural. So you bring in a 62-year-old guy, I think a lot of people are saying, like, what does that get you? And how many years are you going to have this guy before you're then looking for your next head coach? And the other part of it is people kind of have a bad taste in their mouth from the way that things ended in Dallas. They were looking at him as a guy that failed in Dallas, so to speak, because he got fired. But as you dig deeper, the reason why I think the Steelers would be intrigued, first and foremost, he is a Pittsburgh guy. He grew up in in Pittsburgh, in the Greenfield neighborhood. His father was a firefighter who owned a bar. And so that's very classic Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's a very blue collar kind of town with a lot of working class people. And then more importantly, I think he's worked with a number of quarterbacks. He's worked with Aaron Rodgers. He's worked with Brett Favre, and he's worked with Dak Prescott. And so the Steelers are kind of in this situation because they were never able to identify and develop the successor to Ben Roethlisberger. And the head coach quarterback relationship are just such an important part of football. And so really the selling point for Mike McCarthy would be this is a guy who knows offensive football. The league is trending more and more. You've got to score faster and more than the other team. It's not about defense anymore. And this could be a guy that helps you find and develop that next quarterback.
What do you feel like the Steelers need as a head coach? We've seen this leader of men type, almost like a CEO type of head coach. It also feels like so many people right now are hunting for this next offensive guru as well, but really they're in quite short supply, especially in this head coaching cycle. What do you feel like the Steelers need, especially somebody who is looking to step into this void and really make the job their own after Mike Tomlin's just had 19 seasons with the team?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of the mind that the league has trended offensively. And if you look at it, like if you bring in a good offensive coordinator and they do a good job for 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden someone's going to snatch them up as a head coach. So the only way that you're going to keep a good offensive mind as you're building is to pay him the most and make him the top guy. The problem with the current search is, and this is kind of the disappointing thing for Steelers fans, Mike Tomlin stepped away at a time that there's not really a great obvious candidate. It's not like a couple years ago where there was a Ben Johnson or a guy like that, or a Kevin O'Connell, a guy that really was ready for that next step and you felt primed to take him. Like I mentioned Mike McCarthy, the other offensive guys they're looking at are really on the opposite end of the spectrum to an extreme degree. They've got Nathan Shieldhouse, who is a passing game coordinator for the Rams. So not even the offensive coordinator. He's only spent 1 year in the NFL with Sean McVay. And it seems like everything Sean McVay touches turns to gold and everybody wants him. Members of his staff, members of his coaching tree. But he's 35, and he's never called plays, first of all, at this level. So there's some questions about what would you really be getting in him. The other offensive guy that they've interviewed to this point virtually is Clay Kubiak, who's the offensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers. And Kyle Shanahan is one of the most respected offensive minds in the league. He's the head coach, but he also calls the plays. So Clay Kubiak also does not call the plays for the 49ers. So that's kind of the difficult thing that the Steelers are in right now is if they want to go the offensive direction, you either have to go really old with Mike McCarthy or really young with these other guys. Now, what I will say is because of the rules, they're not able to interview everybody right now. If you're, like you mentioned, you were in Seattle, Clint Kubiak, who's Clay's brother, he's the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks. He is an interesting name to me, and I think if the Steelers could get him, I would be most intrigued, I think, of anybody by him. But because of the fact that they're still in the playoffs, they have yet to be able to virtually or in person interview him. And it remains to be seen whether he's going to truly be on their radar.
Final couple of questions from me, Mike. Who are some of these other names then skirting around the job right now? I know that Anthony Weaver, who's been the defensive coordinator for the Dolphins, is set for an interview supposedly at the end of the week. Talk about maybe Chris Shula as well with the Rams, but who are some of these other names who have been flirted and touted as a interview candidate with the Steelers?
Yeah, those are two that are important to touch upon. And I'll start with Chris Shula because I think that he's the favorite one in terms of fans. Fans really like him because his grandfather is Don Shula. And Don Shula was the coach of the Miami Dolphins when they won undefeated. So he kind of comes from football royalty in that way. He more so checks every box you would think of for what the Steelers have historically looked for. He's got the football bloodline. He's 39 years old. So you bring him in, he's going to be your coach for a couple decades. He does coach on the defensive side, and the Steelers have always fashioned themselves as a defensive team. They talk about the steel curtain of the 70s. And so he very much fits their identity and their personality. And also, he just has experience. Like right now, the big criticism for the Steelers was they had the NFL's highest paid defense, but they did not perform like it. And Chris Shula is coordinating the NFL's lowest paid defense in their top 10 in a lot of metrics. And if you look at a lot of the turnovers that they're producing, I look at it and say that's not a great individual play. That's a great play call by the coordinator. So I think that he would be an interesting candidate and one that a lot of people here in Pittsburgh would be a fan of. The other guy you mentioned, Anthony Weaver, the Steelers-Ravens rivalry might be one of the best rivalries in the NFL. And he was on the other side of it for a long time as a player. He's only 45 years old, so he's kind of in that sweet spot in terms of age. And really what you would be getting in him is the leader of men, the guy that has been in the locker room, who can relate to players because he's been there himself, who has charisma and personality. And so I think those would be some of the selling points for him. I'm trying to think of there's a handful of other candidates. The Panthers defensive coordinator, Ayero Avero, he's been a hot name, and he's interesting because you look at the stats and their defense is not very good, but he has a great reputation. Maybe he's going to be in the mix.
Jesse Minter with the Chargers, is he another one?
And Jesse Minter with the Chargers is another one that we should mention. He has an interesting connection to Mike Tomlin. So Jesse Minter's father coached at the University of Cincinnati. And when Jesse Minter was 16 years old, a young defensive backs coach, came along, and his name was Mike Tomlin, and really had an impact on Jesse Minter. And Jesse Minter wanted to play in college football and wanted to be a great athlete himself, realized that wasn't going to be his path, but thought maybe coaching is. And Mike Tomlin very much inspired him to get into coaching. He, again, I think would be that sweet spot. He's in his 40s, young 40s. He is a defensive-minded guy. He has coached at a number of different levels. He was with the Ravens and coaching their secondary for a little bit. He coached at the college level and won a national championship with the University of Michigan. And now he's with the Chargers, and the Chargers have had one of the best defenses the last 2 years. So he, again, seems like a guy that would check a lot of boxes for a team that wants a young defensive mind.
I suppose one of the key tasks with whatever head coach comes into the building, they need to really solve this quarterback problem. Like you mentioned, that Mike McCarthy is maybe somebody with experience of dealing with quarterbacks, may be able to handle that the best. But look, there's a lot of talk about Aaron Rodgers and what is going to be the case, whether that is hanging up his cleats, whether it's moving elsewhere, maybe it's staying with the Steelers. Over the last couple of weeks, what sense have you gathered as to maybe a decision coming, or what could be the feeling with Aaron Rodgers and where he's at right now?
Well, it's always difficult to project what Aaron Rodgers is going to do.
That is true.
He is notoriously private, and as last year's indecision taught us, he's going to do things his way and on his own schedule. But I think the most important thing that I can tell you is before the regular season finale, we asked Aaron about his future. And he could have very easily said, look, I'm only focused on this Week 18 game. I'm only focused on beating the Ravens. Don't talk to me about anything else. But he didn't. What he said was, I'm 42 years old and I'm on a 1-year contract. So you know what the situation is. And so at that point, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, he's thinking this is probably it. And then he said, so I'm going to be a free agent after the year and I'm going to have a lot of options. And then he kind of corrected himself and said, well, maybe not a lot of options, but a couple options. And so as he said that, it certainly left the door open for playing in 2026. Where that is, I think, is connected to a number of different factors. Who's the head coach with the Steelers and what's their vision first and foremost? Would they want him back? And would Aaron Rodgers want to come back? If Mike McCarthy ends up being the coach, maybe they do run it back for one more year. But the other team I think to consider strongly would be the Minnesota Vikings. My colleague Alec Lewis does a lot of great reporting on the Vikings. Evidently, last offseason, Kevin O'Connell, the head coach, and Aaron Rodgers had a lot of discussions about a potential marriage. And their relation dates back 2 decades. And ultimately, the Minnesota Vikings, they had a second-year quarterback in J.J. McCarthy. And really, they were trying to develop him, and that was the hope. It did not go as planned. He had more turnovers than touchdowns this year, didn't really take a step forward. So I feel like his options are play for the Steelers, play for the Vikings, retire. Ranking those and determining which one he might do is a difficult proposition. And I think that it's going to be something we're talking about over and over again, repeatedly, until he finally ultimately decides, which might not be until June like it was last year.
And it's fascinating to see as well, like you mentioned, if Mike McCarthy does come into the building, how all of a sudden those cards maybe switch and there's probabilities going one way or the other. You said something at the very start that I thought was very interesting about that this is going to be almost a cleaning house of the coaching staff. And there's been talk about Arthur Smith. He had a couple of interviews as an OC elsewhere with both Detroit and I think the Chargers, and both of those jobs have been filled. Has he shown enough, Arthur Smith, whether to be warranted to stay in Pittsburgh by a new head coach who comes into the building, or do you believe this is going to be a full clean house and he will be elsewhere or out of a job come the end of this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, so to give you some background on Arthur Smith, I mean, he was a former offensive lineman, and the selling point with him was he was supposed to come in and install this run-heavy scheme and that highlighted the tight end position. And the Steelers have not really run the ball the way that you would expect from that type of coordinator so far. That isn't to say he's a bad offensive coordinator. He just really didn't accomplish the goal that they were looking forward to. So I think that the likelihood is that probably a new coach is going to come in and they're going to want their guy. And I don't think it's going to be Arthur Smith. I guess you never want to close the door, but I would be surprised if he's back. I'll say that. I think that he's probably going to have to find a job elsewhere. Maybe it's as an offensive coordinator somewhere. Maybe, sometimes these coaches that are out of work, they get these senior assistant advisory roles. I could see something like that. He has a really good relationship with Mike Vrabel from their time together in Tennessee. Now Vrabel is with the Patriots. Maybe that ends up being a landing spot, or maybe there's another offensive coordinator job for him. But it sure seems to me like Arthur Smith's days in Pittsburgh are done.
Final question from me then, Mike. I mentioned some of the priorities for a new head coach coming into the building, sorting the quarterback spot, whether that's going to be with Aaron Rodgers or not, or whether it's going to be making the team younger overall. What do you feel like the priority is for a head coach coming into the Steelers building, really to make a statement maybe early on, to get their feet really firmly on the ground? What do you think they need to sort out first when a new head coach joins the Steelers?
Well, the two things, quarterback number one, because initially the Steelers had been stockpiling draft capital, and they've been acquiring it in a variety of ways. They have 12 picks in this draft, and the initial plan was, at least from a distance it seemed, package a lot of those picks, move up in the first round. The draft is in Pittsburgh, make a huge splash and get your future franchise quarterback in the first round. And this was supposed to be a really good quarterback class with Arch Manning at the top, followed by a bunch of other guys. Well, Arch Manning's not coming out this year. Fernando Mendoza is going to go first overall, and the Raiders are in position to get him. The Steelers aren't getting Fernando Mendoza. Maybe Dante Moore, who was probably the next best quarterback from Oregon, he's going to stay in college for another year. It's looking like the Steelers aren't going to have a great opportunity to get that quarterback in the draft. So figuring out some kind of a plan going forward at the most important position, I think, is priority number one. Priority number two is they basically built this defense that I talked about to give Ben Roethlisberger one last chance to make a run at it. And this defense came together just in time to give him one more run. Now that defense risks aging out themselves without accomplishing much of anything. Guys like TJ Watt has never won a playoff game. Cam Hayward has been in uniform for one playoff win. They really need to take a hard look in the mirror and say, are we a contender? The Steelers have to really decide for themselves. Are they actually a contender? Can they actually make noise in the playoffs? Or if you just put duct tape and Mike Tomlin magic together and win a couple lucky games, are you just going to get to 10-7 and get another first-round exit from the playoffs? Like, I think if I were making the decision, if I were Omar Khan, the general manager, I would say success is measured by growth within the roster. It's not going to be measured this year by wins and losses. It's going to be our roster is improved for sustained success. And if I were him, that's the direction I would be going. But ultimately, the head coach is going to have a significant say in that.
It's a fascinating situation. I really can't wait to see how this pans out, especially whether it's in the coming days, weeks, or maybe even months. Mike, as ever, it's an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I would say get some rest, but goodness me, yeah, even though the end of the season's come round, still very busy as ever. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time on talkSPORT.
Yeah, absolutely, Will. Thank you so much for having me.